because I've been looking at this for a very long time. Matter of fact, nearly 20 years ago, I wrote an article about medical parole in New York State. And basically, the exact same criticisms that exist today existed then, even though they've modified the statute several times. And I will give kind of my bottom line is, medical parole will never be, in my opinion, a significant impact on incarceration. I do believe there might be a place for it, but it's only for kind of a small set of cases. What needs to happen is what Fareed was talking about. We have to get away from the punishment paradigm. We're sending far too many people for far too long in prison, and that's what needs to be changed. That's going to have impact on that. I think a second piece is that that to the extent they allow for release, it should be released based upon where the person is now rather than what happens in New York. They're looking at static conditions that never change, and that's why they deny people. That's ridiculous. The court set a sentence. That's supposed to be the minimum sentence. That's based on the nature of your crime. Parole or release should be determined who you are now and what's the nature of the public risk. Third is we have to correct an existing problem, which we have older people, and actually the numbers that I have is that in New York State, if you take 50 and older, now there's a whole definition of what is elderly, but I strongly agree with the 50. In New York, we're over 20%. It's over 10,000 with less than 50,000 people in. That's 20%. And that number has been almost doubling if you look at that large category, and it's because of a ridiculous sentencing structure that we have and a parole system that doesn't let people out, because all the cases you've talked about, people have been denied over and over and over again. So real reform is actually outside of medical parole, in my opinion. And that's where we should look at. But let's now then narrow the issue to, is there a purpose for medical parole, and what should it look like? I believe there is, because there's going to be situations where people get cancer, and they might be 35. They're not necessarily elderly, but they have a medical condition that is exacerbated by being incarcerated. And why are you keeping them in under those circumstances? They are fundamentally no longer a risk. And so we have to do something about that. But let me give you one bottom line. The releases that were happening in New York way back in, when I looked at this first in the 90s, and now they've expanded the statute supposedly, and the release rate hasn't changed at all. And the problem is that there are so many factors, and I don't want to spend all the time going through it, there's so many factors, unless you change every one of those factors, you're really not going to get released, because ultimately they're still punishing people, they're making it far too hard, the wrong people are making the decisions, and you trip over this process, and that's why a significant number of people die during the process because of these factors. So here are the issues that I see very quickly, and I'm not going to go through them. What are the criteria for medical conditions triggering consideration, and what is the criteria for release? And they're not the same thing. Normally there's a medical component and then a non-medical component. Who are making those determinations, and are they competent to make those determinations? And sometimes, as in New York we'll get to in one moment, they conflate those, so the people are actually deciding two things at the same time. Probably the most fundamental issue, and this is parole and whatnot, what level of risk, because release always involves some level of risk. What is your tolerance for risk that the person might offend? I mean, just give you an example, you say in New York they have any danger of returning. Well, you could be almost paralyzed, and in the computer world, you could do some crime. It's not impossible, but if it's any risk, if zero risk, almost no one will ever get out. So hidden in this thing is how much risk is there prepared. Fourth is these processes are so complex and so cumbersome, you can trip anywhere along that, is that they don't work because you have so many steps. And then finally, you have a statute and a criteria, but the implementation of this often falls apart. So you could have the best statute and it still could fail because the implementation of that process is problematic. Now I'd recommend for those in New York, just in April, Vera Institute wrote a report just about medical parole in New York. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but basically they had two basic conclusions. First conclusion is the implementation is really problematic. And later, if we have more time, I'll go through some of that. But they're talking about wrong people, they don't know what they're doing, they can't get it done, there's no time limits and everything. And then they had some changes to the statute that they recommended. So I want to talk about that one piece about what is the criteria. And it is, I want to give a little more detail to kind of show you some of the problems that exist. So in New York, the doctors have to make a determination. And that determination is a medical one to the extent that it talks about do they have a disability, medical or physical, that is difficult to ambulate or to care for yourself? Are there significant restrictions on your ability to care for yourself? That has some meaning. They have one of the tricks, and this is why implementation is the problem, is the original statute had ability to ambulate, and that was a defined criteria, which, as many people know, medical, that is how I got into this issue. I'm sorry, I go back to the history, is I was litigating about HIV care. People were dying in extraordinary numbers inside of the prison. Probably ambulation was the last thing that they lost. And so they couldn't qualify, even though that person was going to die soon. But they could still get up. Maybe they could only walk 20 feet, but they could ambulate. They still have that in the statute. They put an or, but literally there was a hearing on the budget, and the commissioner was testifying, and he still is going to impose that ambulation, even though it's an either or. So you have to be careful of these criteria. But then more importantly, the chief medical officer in docs is still required to basically say, are your disabilities, I'm trying to get my language, is it physically or cognitively incapable of presenting any danger to society? That's literally the chief medical officer has to make that determination. He's a doctor.